4. It had been a hard 36 hours heading east from Normandy. Twice, missing inns and hostelries, Major Richard Sharp bedded down under hedgerows, tethering one of Lucille's best mares to a tree, buying food from farmhouses, ever travelling to Brussels. Lucille had not cried, nor begged him to stay. She had not damned him to hell, nor compared his going to that of her dead husband. Richard considered whether it would have been better if she had. No. Instead, nursing her rounded stomach, Lucille Dubert kissed him tenderly and bidded him to come back to her. That had been much worse, Major Sharp decided. He now could not push her from his mind. So, when he strode through the chateau, knowing that his wife and her love Rossendale were there, when he stood before Wellington's chief of staff to hear he had been made lieutenant colonel and that his command was to be under that of William, Prince of Orange, he knew that, above everything else, above the respect of his men, above the success of his company, that his heart would be fighting for a tiny bit of France. With his best friend by his side. Though he had had the letter from Patrick Harper, his former sergeant, informing him of his re-enlistment, it was only when Richard sought be man, now horse dealer to the aristocracy, that he believed it to be so. Our first is to support the Prussians at Quatre Bras, Sharp told Harper that night. I have a few men under my command, but more are to follow. You'll be telling me that it's our old friends the South Essex, Harper quipped, as they bedded down in the chateau's stable, having downed copious quantities of wine. Aye, Sharp replied. You're dead right, Pat, he nodded. The morning brought light train and a parade of men. I have commanded you before, South Essex, Sharp began, knowing that royal snot rag of Prince of Orange was watching him. He patrolled round the men, not one moved an inch, not one single piece of uniform was out of place. Not one soldier did not know how to stand before a parade sergeant. But it was not a parade sergeant who was bawling at them in a broad Sheffield accent. It was Lieutenant Colonel Sharp, raised in the ranks, as every one of them could tell. He surveyed the men critically, wiping non-existent dust from a taller private's buttons, wetter than that much falling Ost-sea sky. It went on for more than half an hour. By the end, the men, all in their late teens and 20s, for the battles at Austerlitz and Gneisenau had eaten up many, knew exactly who Lieutenant Colonel Richard Sharp was, and what he was about. So, it came as a hard shock when the Prince of Orange pulled him aside when he had dismissed the sergeant, who dismissed the men. The prince had bid him walk in the gardens of the chateau. The gentility of the setting, as war raged so near, disgusted Richard Sharp, and he was not a man easily disgusted, or indeed, bothered by very much at all. You must not harangue the men so, Sharp, Prince William chided, clearing his throat and bearing close to Sharp. Let them love you by leading them by example. Leading the South Essex by example, Richard repeated, with enough of faux respect in his tone to mask the contempt he felt for the man next in line to the Dutch throne, and cousin to the Prince Regent. There, you see, you have it, the prince exclaimed, believing his message had got through immediately. But not the South Essex. Oh? Sharp, dismayed. Was it not that company I just addressed who I am commanding, Your Grace? Oh, but you see, Sharp. The prince exclaimed, those are the men you will be commanding. But they are no longer the South Essex, no, they are the Prince of Orange's own. Sharp took some steps away from the prince. He had, Sharp decided, a decidedly unclear awareness of personal space. So you must lead them, my men, and watch them fight for glory. Lead them from the rear, Your Grace? Sharp asked, annoyed at the nonsense this overbred popinjay was spouting. Precisely, Sharp, the prince concluded, as if that had been a lesson well taught. He leaned towards Sharp, face close to his. Yes, Your Grace, Sharp reluctantly offered, unhappy at the prince's proximity. If you will excuse me. More are coming, Sharp, the prince continued, ignoring him. We have many recruiting parties over the whole of my lands. He leered at Sharp. This was too much, and the newly appointed lieutenant colonel felt his hand drop to his sword. Yes, go, the prince commanded, sensing Sharp's disdain. Several riflemen, some once of your own company, Sharp, are here at your command. Sharp turned suddenly and saluted the prince, who returned it, superciliously, then marched off towards the chateau's outbuildings, which were holding the incoming officers. "And get your Dutch uniform on, Sharp," the prince called, "you're my man, now." "That pompous, self-important horse sack," Sharp ejaculated, as he threw the door shut. He marched across the kitchen before turning and thumping on the rough, wooden table. At the other end, Pat Harper leaned back in his chair, where he had been sitting, waiting for Sharp to return. And, I suspect, on the lookout for a fag, for all the standing close and heavy breathing he was doing. "Well, I've got something to cheer you up," Harper replied, his deep, Donegal voice filling the room. "Or rather." From the back room someone pushed open the door. Harris. Sharp stared at his former private, grinning in delight. "Matt. How are you?" He strode quickly towards his former rifleman, drawing him close and clapped him on the back, clad as it was in green. "I thought you were going to Oxfordshire? To take a job?" Sharp kicked a chair over to him and pulled out one for himself. Pat pulled out 2 more boats of ale and handed one each to Sharp and Harris. "Thanks," Matt said, resting a weary hand on the glass before taking a swig. "Or enlisting in the Navy?" Sharp pressed, looking over to Pat. He, too, was staring at Matt Harris, waiting for an answer. "Couldn't abide it," Matt said, "though I tried it. Too restrictive. I took up the job at Highclere. As soon as I heard we were back at war and the army was recruiting again, I gave in my notice. Walked to Portsmouth, walked from St. Malo here." "Why?" "Pays better," Matt explained. "The job was fair, but you know, the army." Sharp and Harper knew. It was known by any man who had ever been in the army, successful or no. Comradeship, shared purpose, regular meals. They all knew the lure of that. That was why they'd all forsaken the quiet life just to be there. They were soldiers. "And I met Dan on the way over," Matt added, "said he'll be here too. Took a different road to me." "Poaching," Pat proposed, knowing Hagman. "Probably. Any others of the 95th here?" inquired Harris. "Or ... 60th? "None," Sharp shook his head. "Though I'm commanding the South Essex. Or, as the bastard bugger of an Orange now calls them, the Prince of Orange's company. Pa." They ate a hearty tea cooked by the Belgian widow who had once lived in the outbuilding, who was servant at the chateau and who now, sulkily, had been commandeered to cook and clean for those billeted under her former roof. She glowered at them and grumbled something in Walloon. "What a bundle of joy," Sharp laughed, the heat draining from his words. "Got any more where this came from, Pat?" Sharp shook his empty bottle. "No, so's I haven't." Pat protested. "I wasn't expecting to get to Brussels so quickly, that was for tonight." "Well, I have this," Harris declared, pulling out a half bottle of rum. "The head gardener will think the butler's had it." He knocked it onto the table, and Sharp dragged himself to his feet, rifling through the one rude cupboard on the wall. The woman scowled at him, then, in a barrage of foul language, slammed the door behind her. Sharp looked at Harris as much as to ask for a translation. "Let's just say we are not in her good books." Sharp pulled 3 glasses from the shelves and thrust them onto the table. "Wine glasses for rum," Harris commented. "I suppose there are privations in war." He flicked off the cork and filled the wide-bowled flutes. "It tells yet something," replied Harper. "Can't give us a spoon for the stew but have wine glasses in abundance." Something fluttered out of his hand. "What's this?" asked Sharp, retrieving it from the straw-strewn floor. "A letter," Harris replied. "I can see it's a bloody letter, Matt." Sharp laughed. He looked at the outside. "A woman's hand," he nodded, approvingly. "It's from a lucky," Harris said, as Sharp scrutinized it. He raised his head, clearly shocked, paused mid-bite of meat stew. A few drops of gravy dripped onto. "I thought she was in America." "You took her to Le Havre?" Harris asked. Sharp inclined his head. "Tom Wright," he mused, pushing the letter back into Matt's hand, then took up the wine glass of rum. "Where are you now?" In South Carolina, she says, Harris said, pushing the letter into his coat. Then, she plans Germany. Good old Roberta Haycock, Pat added. Not that name around here. Sharp warned, then looked down at his stew, moving his head from side to side. If she has any sense she will be in Paderborn or Osnabrück or wherever the hell Fredrickson lives. Dortmund, Harris specified, recalling the lengthy missive he had received from the woman who was as close to him as a sister, of wonder, of hopes, of betrayal and of regret. But, sir, haven't you heard? The Hohenzollerns are calling up their old commanders. Harris thought for a moment. Do you think he will answer? He might. And Roberta? Put in Pat. She was one fierce soldier, so she was. With him? Asked Harris. Maybe. But what will she find in America? Many a young woman has made such a promise before. She has honored such promises before, Harris replied. You don't think she might enlist? Sharp looked startled. I bloody hope not. She promised never to Wellington, and all. His coldness took Harris aback. Then, she's probably still in America, Matt supposed. Sharp drained his soup. With whatever her business there is. He pushed his bowl away, brooding on the morrow. The epithet Silly Billy was spot on. And, with this war starting up again, she would do well to stay there. 88,888,888. Early morning light pushed its way through the coach windows as the coach from Le Havre clattered into Dortmund's market square. The horse pulled up sharply, tipping two bodies onto the floor. Tom rubbed his face, as he pulled himself up, then held out a hand. Kit took it and grinned. Come on, Tom said, feeling a resolve not to be swayed from her purpose by the boy, who would certainly encourage her to do something frivolous and, probably, dangerous. They climbed down from the coach into the warm June sunshine. Birds coursed the air high above and everywhere seemed to have a gentle calmness round it, so unlike the hubbub of the port she had just come from. Defying all the odds, Tom found that she was well rested, and they bounded from the coach, Kit hailing the driver in Frisian. How much the lad had paid him, only the lightness in his money bag could tell. For an uninterrupted 12-hour journey would not have been cheap. Tom stepped out onto the smooth cobbles of the city, surrounding a central fountain, which served to provide refreshing the water for the horses. Around it, on all four sides, were the tall townhouses that typified the architecture of Northern Europe. It had not been damaged by war, Tom noticed. This town, though on the thoroughfare from Paris to Russia, had kept its gentility. Just as William had. A sudden surge of affection rushed through Tom's body, with the ache of desire to find him. Across beyond the street, the tall, lithe boy was busy in conversation with a man and a woman. Kit seemed to have got some information from them, and the top-hatted gentleman pointed down the street they were standing on. Kit nodded at the couple, as if in thanks, then approached another man, round-capped and carrying a basket of what looked like coal. Tom looked down at the horse trough. Her own reflection stared back at her. She was just as tanned as she had been fighting, and her hair had grown, drawn back in a ribbon, as a man would, cotton shirt, with trousers to match the jacket. Anywhere, she would pass as a gentleman, and had done since she had stepped aboard a French frigate which had conveyed her from Boston. She had nothing of her old life with her now, she had given away the rest to other men on the ship, those who were traveling to the Americas for a new life under Jefferson, to out food in their stomachs. They had little pride and had no compunction in accepting foreign military coats, for they would keep them warm regardless which country had issued them. Nothing, with the exception of her 60th uniform. In her bundle of greatcoat, concealing her pistol and short dagger, purchased in New York before she headed down to South Carolina, she had kept it, and had worn it when she had found her father. Perhaps it had been the reduction in her physical activity that had caused her to put on weight, whereas it had been too big on her 18 months ago in Portugal, but now, she found, it seemed to fit snugly around the chest and hips. Kit was now examining the shops and houses in this, the center of Dortmund, his black curls shining in the morning sun. This stirred a memory in Tom's mind, and an image of the lovely Madame du Bert flashed across her mind, whose hair shone like that too, and whose body curved as a woman's should. William had asked her to marry him. Did he still think of her? She was away with Major Sharp. Clearly they were happy even though they weren't married. She had spurned him, and now, without a word in the meantime, Roberta had been a long time coming, and, now, coming in the form of Tom Wright, gentleman, unwomanly in shape and action, with not even a letter written to him. It was only now, as she stood on his city, that she could see the folly of this. Just the heavy cloud of guilt of her actions in South Carolina began to press on her shoulders. It was blown away by the zephyr that was Kit Marlowe. He bounded over to Tom, face alight. "I spoke to a man over there. On the main street, Hotchstress. He says, along with a Herr Schneider, a Herr Fredrickson has a law practice." Tom paused as joy surged in her chest, all other doubt receding. This boy, younger than she but looking older, short black curls bobbing in the sunlight, on the way to the gallows, presumably for theft if the trouble in Le Havre was anything to go by, was giving him, Tom, the perfect answer she was all too ready to hear. Was there a deception here? Yet, another part of Tom's mind thought, Kit had returned the silver to her. Further, Tom's offer to part ways had brought around a kind of desperation in the boy. There was more to Kit Marlowe than first appeared. "We'll go then?" Kit asked, excited, like a dog who had just brought a bone in for his master's approval. "Yes," Tom replied, decisively, as Kit shouldered his brown Bess. "To Hotchstress and to Captain Fredrickson." Above the line ground floor of the street to which Kit had been directed the sign read, Hotchstress and Munsterstress. They walked in silence along it, looking at the Gothic-lettered signs painted onto wood as they went by, Schmidt, Drucker, Muller, and Kleidung. Shops were interspersed with tall townhouses. Two women stepped onto the cobbles dressed in what looked like the directoire style of clothing popular in Paris at the turn of the century, hair curled and beribboned. And then, further along came, Sanwalt, Schneider and Fredrickson. "Lawyer," Kit said, reading the sign as he pulled on Tom's arm. But Tom did not need to be encouraged to stop, for it was the latter of the two names that had caught Tom's eye. She pushed down on the latch of the door and stepped inside. Kit waited outside as Tom shut the door. Her mind was racing as fast as her heart. She had found him, at last. Lying in fields with a militia force in Jamestown, up to her shoulders in freezing river water, walking with holes in her boots to the estate which her father had purchased with money from bribes from the Yanks to betray his country. In each terrible situation after another, her mind would be quieted by dreaming of this moment. Fredrickson had asked her to marry him, and Tom had said Roberta would give him her answer after she had done what she needed to do in the Americas. She had gone there. She had been there and done the unthinkable. And now she was here, with her answer. Guten Morgen, a young man said, a round-faced, blond youth of about 16 as she approached the desk set in the center of the office. "Wie kann ich Sie helfen?" Tom stared. He knew no German. Yet, she could not bear to bring in the boy who had attached himself to her to translate. "Excuse me," Tom began, as a flash of recognition of a different language passed over the young man's face. "Allow me to introduce myself," the young man said, in clipped English. "I am Thaddeus Bechtold. I am junior partner to Alfred Schneider. How may I be of assistance, sir?" For once, Tom's forthrightness failed her. She stuttered, and looked back to the door. "I am looking for a Captain Herr Fredrickson," she managed. "I have called about a matter which I need to." Tom faltered, then fell silent. "May I speak to Herr Fredrickson?" Young Herr Bechtold shook his head. "I am afraid he is from the office today," the boy said. "Would you like me to take a message?" Tom said nothing for a good few minutes. Where this youth was standing she always imagined, in some iteration, her former captain standing, smiling, calling Hulbuln again. When she found her tongue to speak, Tom realized that Bechtold was staring at her neck. She could never disguise the dark line where, in a rope noose, it had taken her body weight. Self-consciously, Tom placed her fingers to the marks. Do you know when Herr Fredricksen will return? Or, do you have his home address? Thordus Bechtold was still looking at her neck, and drew his eyes unwillingly to hers. But if he had been going to answer, the chance was lost, for at that moment a woman pushed open the door behind Tom. She turned, and looked into the face of a middle-aged woman, pale eyes, face trimmed with spiral curls under a large bonnet. Frau Schäfernacker, Mr. Bechtold acknowledged, then looked back to Tom. Is that all, sir? But before Tom could answer, Mrs. Schäfernacker burst into a giggle, which turned into a sob, stepping past Tom and taking Bechtold's hands. She began talking, and it was as if a little sprite had come to rest on Tom's shoulder, for the words arriving into her ear were English. I gave come to the lawyer, and I wish to speak to Herr Schneider or Herr Fredricksen. Tom turned, and looked directly into the face of Kit Marlowe. Neither Mr. Schneider or Mr. Fredricksen are here, Kit continued, eyes merry at Tom's astonishment. But, before he could continue, the boy Thordus leaned across the teak desk and into bed. Firearms are not permitted. Kit, shouldering his rifle, reluctantly withdrew and stood outside the office window, nodding at Tom. Tom nodded back, as much as to say, acceptable. Ik find mijn nachsten manner roos, Veilaged, Thordus Bechtold replied, clearly out of his depth. Then, in English added, another for Herr Fredricksen. He wrote some notes into a large ledger that lay open on the table, before Mrs. Schäfernacker waved a goodbye to the young man. And, die name? Bechtold asked, then, switched to English. Your name, sir? He held his quill pen, poised. No, Tom rebuked. It does not matter. But, perhaps, Herr Fredricksen has a message for me? I can seek, the young man said. Please, tell me your name. He looked around the desk for something, then opened one of the desk's drawers. Thomas Wright. She stopped herself from leaning forward. No, Bechtold said, as he leafed through the contents of the drawer. Tom lolmed away. Had she not, she may have spied one letter, piled onto the table with the rest, made out in Fredricksen's crisp, neat script which read, Roberto Haycock. But she did not, and could not walk from that solicitor's office with joy in her heart. Tom turned back when she heard Bechtold say, unfortunately, no. I will make a note you called, though? He insisted. He had moved on, of course, Tom told herself, her stomach growing hollow. The hatred for her father, clearly he could not separate that from many feelings he had had for her. What a fool she was. Tom had thought that their night together meant more than it had, then. Do you know where he is? Will he be here tomorrow? She asked, desperately. The boy, though clearly overstepping his role, saw the look on Tom's face. I do not believe Herr Fredricksen will be at the office for some considerable time. Why? Bechtold beckoned her over. He has been called. The Royal House of Hohenzollern have called in all their officers. Called in their officers? But, why? We are no longer at war. Haven't you heard? The boy smiled, dimples forming in his cheeks. But there was no humor, no mirth. Our army has reformed to combat the enemy. Under Field Marshal Blücher. Yours too. In Brussels. Tom stood still for a few minutes, taking this all in. But why? Tom asked. Bonaparte was defeated. He was exiled to Elba. He was, Bechtold corrected. And he was liberated, spirited from that island by men who were loyal to him. Bonaparte is back, the boy concluded, solemnly, and he means to continue what he began,